Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
A lot of the process is figuring out how to turn stuff that's really abstract and meaningless into things that are personally meaningful. So you can get excited about them. They have associations to other things in your mind, and it just kind of stretches out in your memory as having all these different arms to it that make it come to life rather than just a symbol on a piece of paper.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's episode. On today's show we have Nelson Dellis, and we're talking about memory, how to remember customers' names, because that can be really awkward when you forget it or when you don't just take it in when you first meet them, product information, and anything essentially. You can find out more about Nelson over at nelsondellis.com. His charity is climbformemory.org. And he's also, if you get super into this and you want to learn more about the whole thing in general, he also runs a memory tournament, which is extremememorytournament.com. All the links and everything that we talk about is available in the show notes over at salesman.red. And with that, let's get on to today's show. Hey Nelson, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you for having me. How you doing?
I'm good, sir. You're more than welcome. And today we're going to get into something that I find insanely interesting, and I think it's useful for both in sales and out of sales, and that is memory, improving it, remembering stuff. Clearly, this has lots of applications just in mine and the audience lives in general. And sure. I want to paint a bit of a picture here for you, Nelson, to add context to our conversation.
Yep.
So I recently recorded an episode with Mark Shannon, and we looked at techniques of how to remember faces. So I want to go deeper than that on this level, on this episode, and I want to look at how essentially we can remember anything from a data perspective. And so we touched on this just before I clicked record, but in my medical device days, I would be given a new product would come out, and I'd be given literally a wad of documents like this thick of so I sold endoscopy equipment and endoscopes. So it would be how thick they are, the optics, what techniques they're used in, any procedural differences that have come in with this particular product that you've got to show to surgeons, and all these kind of things all add up. And then you've got to go, well, how does it fit into the product range? How does it fit in with your competitors? Is yours thinner, wider, bendier, whatever it is? So you've got all these characteristics. And then very often, as soon as you get dumped this pile of paperwork that you've got to learn, of course, then your customers are dead excited and they want to see it straight away. So you've only got a few days perhaps to learn most of it to be able to have an intelligent conversation. And put it in perspective in the minds of the customers that you're dealing with. So before we jump in too deep, and I know I've just thrown a lot at you there, let's start with the very basics, a massively leading question, because I'm sure this isn't the case. But say you've got all this data, it's both lists of boring numbers and also images and other things of that nature. Is the best way to learn this just to, for a week or so, every now and again, just take it off your desk, have a quick look through it, put it back, and then at the end of the week hope that it's sunk in? Or is there better ways to go about all this?
Right. That is one way to memorize something, and that's honestly the way that most people would approach it. You'll have the procrastinators who will try to do it the last night, but if you're good, you'll say, okay, I'll start a week in advance and kind of review it over and over and over again. The problem with that is it's not very efficient, right? You're taking a week to memorize something. The other thing is it's boring. It's a tedious task. If there's a way that's fun, quick, and better in terms of it staying with you longer, then why not do that? So that would work, right? I'm sure it would work. You get it in your head at some point. And then the review part is somewhat important. We'll get to that later. But there are quicker ways to get that information, whatever you have down there, that list of numbers and images, in your head faster. Once it's there, you can do anything with it. You can review it on the fly. You could be in your car, just go over it in your head. And then that review part comes in.
Let me just jump in before we get into the practical aspect of all this and just build a bit of suspense. So I want to ask you, clearly, we all, throughout school, college, university, whatever you're doing, even if you don't go to university, there's still exams in school that we've all passed, some people longer ago than others, I guess. But and in most workplaces, there's things that you got to remember, whether we're talking about specifics in sales here or otherwise. Why aren't the skills that we're going to talk about now, why aren't they taught in schools. Why doesn't everybody knows this? Because it seems I'm smiling as I say this because it's stupid that we're not all taught this at the age of 5.
Yeah.
And then from the age of 5 to whenever you leave school or college, and then when you start your career and all that, it doesn't mean that you'd have to do less work or it'd be easier, but it means that you'd be able to retain more information and be more effective at what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we all have a memory, right? This is like the one thing that we all have. And in my opinion, I think we all have the same amount of skill, the potential for memory. Not necessarily the same skill level because other people have mastered it to different degrees, but we all have that potential within us from an early age. It's like it's how we learn. So
Sure.
You think that would be the first thing we mold in kids. And that's kind of the thing that's always driven me mad is when I figured this out. I just finished grad school. Well, I'd finished my undergrad and was going into grad school, but I was like, I could have used this. Why didn't anybody tell me this? And these techniques are the oldest things, known. These are thousands of years old. It's what the Greeks and the Romans used to remember. To be intelligent, you had to have a good memory. You had to.
And just tell us a little bit more about that, Nelson, because I think that's fascinating. Again, before we get into the practical side of things, because it's not like we've just been dumping people into fMRI machines and recent changes in neuroscience have enabled us to learn these new mechanisms. And you might be able to tell me that new things have been developed because of things like that. But seemingly that a lot of this, even though I've only scratched the surface of it with what I've learned about it so far, it is, as you said, like thousands of years old. Yeah,
it's a classic learning technique that I think has come in waves and left as well. And I guess the more that technology has crept in, the less need we've had for it with computers and phones and books and everything. But yeah, the story goes is that this Greek Simonides was having a dinner party, and he stepped out for a moment. They had a long table with all guests around it, and he stepped out for a moment. The whole place crumbled. Everybody was dead, mangled beyond recognition. But with Simonides' memory or thought process, he closed his eyes and was able to picture every person and where they were sitting. So it was a location-based thing. And I guess from that, he realized that our memories are actually quite good at remembering location-specific things. And that's where this whole idea of memory palaces and thinking in pictures and visualization comes from. And that's how people would memorize speeches and, stories that they'd pass down, the names of soldiers in their armies, things like that.
And let's dive into this then. So massively leading question here in what's easier to remember? your room of friends getting crushed and where they are, or a spreadsheet of dimensions of your product?
Right. It's going to be the crushed friends, unfortunately. But for a few reasons. One, this is your room or your hall, that place. Like if you close your eyes and imagine your apartment, your house, these are things that you walk through and live and experience every day without thinking about it. It's pre-memorized to an extraordinary degree. So there's that. And then also it's your friends, people with movements and actions and emotions. Like these are things that are meaningful. You have relationships with these people. Some you don't, you just met, but you had, a thought about them and they made you feel a certain way or whatever. Whereas a spreadsheet, it doesn't really make you feel much other than maybe some stress or something, but it's just a list of numbers which are meaningless. They're symbols, they're abstract things. So, and we'll get to it, but a lot of the process is figuring out how to turn stuff that's really abstract and meaningless into things that are personally meaningful. So you can get excited about them. They have associations to other things in your mind, and it just kind of stretches out in your memory as having all these different arms to it that make it come to life rather than just a symbol on a piece of paper.
And tell me if I'm wrong here, Nelson, because I'm not 100% sure. I might be just talking absolute rubbish. But a memory is made up of connections between neurons in your brain. It might not be as simple as that. I've honestly no idea. And then deeper, more entrenched memories, do they have more physical connections? Because we can all understand the idea that if you tie emotion to something, you're going to remember it. It's going to be more real to you. But is there a link then between the amount of physical connections in the brain that make up these memories as well?
I'm not a doctor. I don't know all this science, but I think that's what it is. I think, say there's a symbol there, right, that you've never seen before, that just stands alone. It's dead. It's just the thing. Of course, your brain is lighting up and analyzing this thing and trying to figure out what it means, what its relation is, whatever. But take a picture of your mother, right? Imagine all the different reaches or connections that it's activating, right? You think of the food, right, that she cooked you when you were a little kid, and that activates the taste and different memories when you were with your friends, and maybe that time when you learned, all the planets, somehow you were eating her food, like it can just be so expansive, like so many connections when it's something personal and deep and that has a lot of entrenched meaning, right? It's just so many more connections between different things. And I think that's really what makes a memory stick.
Cool. Well, let's get practical with it then. So you mentioned the memory palace technique. Is that the best way to go about, or let me rephrase that and start from the scratch with this. Yep. You've got a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Should we be learning the numbers on the spreadsheet, or should we be turning the spreadsheet into something else to then use a technique on it? What would be the best way to go about that?
Numbers are a bit tricky because they're so abstract. But the basic process that I approach memorizing anything is first visualization, right? I want to take whatever it is I'm memorizing and turn it into a picture. A picture because I can see it in my mind and all those associations that come with it. So say it's a list of words. Let's just start with a simple thing like a grocery list, right? That's easier. I mean, if I see the word, I got to get milk, right? That's on my list of 40 items. I can visualize that. And, I can just keep it as simple as a milk carton in my mind, or I can imagine a cow spraying milk everywhere. There's a lot of different ways you can go, but that's easier to visualize, and it's easy to translate that word into that. Okay. Then you go to something like a number. It's not necessarily obvious how you would do that. And that's why in the memory world, this whole step of encoding, trying to translate these images and these things into images, you have to have developed a little system to translate. So for numbers, and especially in these memory competitions, we have some pretty complex systems to translate big chunks of numbers into singular images. But there are some basic systems out there that you can learn quickly if you Google it. There's the major system, kind of a number rhyme system that will give you an instant image for a number. And that way you can look at this spreadsheet and look at a number and it turns into something else. You see a 1, it's a pencil. You see a 2, it's a shoe. Or, there's different things like that.
So are we just naturally not good at doing numbers because they're a modern phenomenon in the grand scheme of things, that we've created them to, I guess the Greeks and the Romans were the people who put all this together, and before that it would be, well, yeah, I've got 4 sheep in my field, and that's probably about as complicated as you need to get.
Exactly. Yeah, I like to think of it that way, that all these things that we have trouble memorizing these days, names, numbers, complex sales sheets and specs, these are modern abstractions. I mean, back in the day where it was very, very simple, before books, before, anything, it was as simple as that. Okay, I have 4 sheep. But it wasn't even the number 4. You just see 4 sheep. It was very visual, yeah. Right? Or, you got to be able to recognize what's something you can eat versus something that's poisonous, something like that. Very visual, right? Language, philosophy, mathematics, all these things are relatively new for our brains. So every time we see something complicated like that, it's not as obvious as seeing 4 sheep and having it imprinted on our mind. It's like, I always do this at my talks. I'll start by having them close their eyes, and I describe this really bizarre situation with Albert Einstein and George Bush kind of eating donuts, playing guitar. Like I paint this image, and it's really easy to visualize. You just close your eyes, and this kind of scene unfolds before your mind. But then I unveil they open their eyes that it's this string of like 45 numbers that I've encoded. And I asked them, what's easier to picture what I just told you, or to picture this number and memorize it? Nobody can do that number that way. I mean, unless you have a system. But that's the thing. It's like easy for our brains to just picture something visual, but really uncomfortable kind of. It's difficult when you see this number, this list of abstract things. So our brains just don't work the same way, and that's why we have to trick it into seeing it the other way.
So for someone who can remember long numbers and perhaps aren't trained in all of this,
yeah,
are they likely just using a system and not realizing they're using a system?
Yeah, I mean, to be straightforward, I've never met anybody who can memorize the amount of digits that trained memory athletes can do using a system.
And how many digits is that, to put it into context?
Even beginners can do about 100 digits, and we do it in 5 minutes. That's the time limit, but the record's about 520.
Wow.
Yeah. So 520 digit number, or 52 American phone numbers in 5 minutes.
I don't even know my own number. That's how ridiculous. I know it ends in 422. That's
Yeah, it's your cell phone, right? Who cares?
That's amazing. As you're saying all this, Nelson, something's popping into my mind.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy because I've never thought about this before. And what you're saying is put into perspective, and it's making total sense to me now. The scope sizes for the endoscopes I used to sell would 25, 19, 17, 15, 9.
Okay.
I think that's what they were, and that isn't. I'm not physically using anything to remember that by. That's just stuck in my brain, that pattern.
Yeah.
But there were a set of colours, so I don't know. I can't remember what order they were in now, but they were, say, green, blue, red, and yada yada. So I used to remember the colours, and then the number would be just thrown in with the colour. So if you ask me what scope to pick out the bag, I would always say get the blue one, not get the 29. And so this is what you're saying now. I've come up with a system for myself that I didn't even realize that I had.
Yeah.
In hindsight, which is really weird.
Yeah, and you'll find that. I mean, and I think the people that are good at numbers just kind of naturally are either of a good math background, have good number sense. They're not afraid of numbers. A lot of people, at least in the States, hate math, and they find kind of reasons why the numbers are there, or some little patterns, and that's a system in itself. I mean, a good example is yesterday I was talking with a friend of mine he's got the world record for calculating calendar dates, right? So you give him a date and he can tell you it's a Tuesday or whatever. He's trained that. He's really good. He has the algorithm and he can do it really fast. But I was asking him, because I'm trying to learn it a little bit. I was like, for the leap years, how do you remember the leap years? I mean, obviously I could just memorize them, but I was curious how he does. And he said, well, if you think about it, so all the years between 00 and 99, so like 1984 is a leap year. He was saying, okay, anything that ends in a 4 or 8, because it's divisible by 4, this is the rule. If it leads with, an even number. So if it's a 2, 4, 6, 8, and a 4 and an 8, then it's a leap year, right? And I was like, okay, but he was like, I just say to myself that, an even number and a 4 and an 8 kind of go together. It feels good, and that's just how I remember. That's the rule I gave myself. I don't know if that was too complicated, but the point is he made sense of it to himself. Like he gave it some reason, some system, and that's also with names. When you memorize names, there are techniques for it, but even as simple as saying, like, my name's Nelson and you just met me, if you give in your mind a reason why my name would be Nelson, that's a system in itself. Like, oh, you say Nelson, because he might be the son of someone called Nell, and I don't know. You just make some reason up, and then that's the system. You've given it more meaning than it would have been just by itself.
So I might be getting totally too deep into this, but I find it interesting in that you've got this voice in your head that's doing all this talking,
right,
and is essentially telling your brain to stick it into this information into the little hard drives and remember the different things. where does the voice come from in all of this? I don't know if you've ever pondered this. We're going totally off sales for a second here, and I'll bring it back in a second.
Sure.
But how does your brain fit in with the voice? Because I don't know if you've got an answer to this, but I've never sussed that out, and this is something that we've thought about in the pub and talked about after 15 pints. And clearly that's probably not the best place to get an answer. Talking to a memory action hero probably is a better place to start.
But yeah, I mean, that voice is say I'm memorizing a number. I mean, that voice is the thing in my head that's translating everything and explaining the story to me. You know, like I see this row of 8 numbers and it says that's Michael Jackson jumping on a banana or whatever in the bathroom. That voice is happening in my head as I read it. Who is that voice? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. That's a deep question, I think, but that's me. It's me. I guess that's me. It's the same voice that when I'm climbing, he's like, you can keep going or you should turn around. You should quit. You know, I don't know.
Good man. Okay. Let's get practical again for this from the perspective of, so numbers, seemingly they're extremely difficult to remember. There's systems in place. You can give me some pointers and we'll link to some in the show notes of the episode. Because it seems that they're quite complicated to talk about in the time frame that we've got. So we'll put them in the show notes.
Okay.
But how about using the perspective of me going into a procedure with a surgeon and things need to be done in a certain way, in a certain order, but this is a visual and tangible process. Is there a method to remembering the steps of something that's more like that?
Yeah, great question. So when you have a list of steps, instructions, or just a list, whatever, something where the order matters, the best technique is this memory palace idea. And that was this kind of the second part to what I was saying before. The first part was visualization, finding a way to encode the information. But secondly, how to store it in a structured, ordered manner so that you can access it in that structured way, you know, whenever you need it. The problem is when people do that rote memorization stuff, sure, you're memorizing it in order, but if you forget a step, you may or may not remember the next one. There's no structure to it. It's just kind of whatever was on the page, blast it into your mind and then hope for the best. So this memory technique works like, as we were saying before, you remember your house, familiar places very well. It could be your path you take to work, your drive to work, your favorite walk in Paris, whatever. So what you do is you imagine this place as a house, a storage facility for these list of instructions, which each piece of instruction you've encoded into an image. So, you know, some can be single words, some could be numbers, some could be a sentence like, you know, do this and then do this. So what you have to do is find a way to encode that first. Like I said before, if it's a simple thing, you can just translate it to what it reminds you of or makes you think of. But if it's like a long sentence, you might choose out the key words and just get the general gist or imagine what the actual sentence is saying. You know, pick up the scalpel, whatever is first step. You could picture that. But you want to store that visual along the path through this place. So a great example is just take your house, right? And imagine waking up in the morning and what you do in your normal routine. Where do you start? In your bedroom. Okay, so that would be the first place you start. Then you maybe go to the restroom, wash your face, take a leak, whatever. That's the second place. Then you maybe get in the shower. That's the third. Then put on your clothes. So you go to the closet, then go to the kitchen. So you make kind of this little pathway through your house, something that makes sense. You don't want to jump around, something that is just natural. It's pre-memorized because you do it every day. Mm-hmm. And then you choose specific locations along this path. And those locations are important because those are the anchors that you're going to use to store each of those items, those instructions. So if the first thing is pick up the scalpel and you're starting in your bedroom, you know, on your bed, you can imagine yourself picking up the scalpel. And if you want to really take that picture home, make it more memorable, maybe go overboard and say you're taking that scalpel and just like destroying your bed, right? Feathers everywhere. You know, it's just a mess. You can hear the sounds of the scalpel scratching against your mattress, all those types of things to make it memorable. Then you move on to the next step and you know, where did you go? You went to the the sink, right, to wash your face. So maybe it is, make, an X incision or something, like an X-shaped incision. Okay, so then you think there's an X rated magazine in the sink, right? I'm making it kind of over the top just because that's a better way to remember things. And then you keep moving that way. And the idea is that when you're in surgery and you're trying to remember the steps, hopefully you're a little more practiced at if you're a surgeon. But
Well, let me jump in there.
yeah,
What's the difference between using all these techniques to remember things and what's going on when you just know them and it just flows? What's the difference?
That's a good distinction, because just because you have it in your head doesn't mean that you're a good surgeon, right? So there's two parts to it. One is, at some point you got to get that information in your head. You got to learn it. So that means you have to have it memorized. Doesn't mean that you know it perfect, but you know it's in your head perfect and you could access it. So a good example is I've had to do some little commercial things and they gave me a script. And the first time I ever did this, I was like, I'm a memory champion. This is easy. I'll just memorize it the night before. And I did. I had it memorized. I could tell you, I could write it down word for word perfect, but it didn't translate on screen because I could say it, but I was like, thinking for each line, and it wasn't fluid at all. It looked really bad. And there I am trying to act as natural as possible. So what I had to do was memorize it. Okay. But then it's the practice, right? You just got to review it, access it a lot. But the nice thing is once it's in your head, you could go on with life without ever having to look at it on paper or anywhere. It's in your head. That's where you review it. And that's kind of the beauty thing of this technique. And I stress to people, it's not necessarily making you learn it faster, but it's putting it in your head faster, which it has to get there at some point, right? So as a surgeon, you get these steps in your head, and you can review it as much as you want while you sleep, while you drive. And then, of course, it's the practice.
And is there any steps or protocol for the rehearsing of it? Do we need to do it so often, within so many days, within then a month? What I'm getting at here is the idea of like spaced repetition learning and things like that. Is there because I'm sure this has been researched, but is there a rough protocol or way of going about doing this? Or is it as simple as you just do it, and then when you can't remember it so well, you spend a little bit of time going over it again, and that sinks it back feet deeper in?
Yeah. I mean, the goal, I guess, especially in something very important for work, is to get it so natural, ingrained in your long-term memory, right? And that's where that spaced repetition comes in, because there is a science to it. I don't know exactly, like I wouldn't give you an exact thing. I roughly would say about, if you're learning something, do it maybe every day for the first week, then maybe every other day the next, and kind of taper off that way. But there are apps out there that will test you and categorize everything you need to know in the proper way. There's a great app called Anki, Anki, for reviewing. It's like flashcards type thing, but they keep track of what you know and what needs to be reviewed when it's been too long. Memorise, Memrise. It's a great website to learn languages that way. So yeah, that spaced repetition is super important, because ideally, once you have it in your head, you want to get that into your long-term memory. The nice thing is, with those techniques, it sticks for quite a while without having to review. But if you're super serious about really learning something and keeping it in your head, you need to approach it with that spaced repetition after you've used the technique to get in your head.
Love it. Amazing stuff. Well, Nelson, I've got one question that I ask everyone that comes on the show. I know you are not a quote-unquote salesperson, but you'll have an insight to this, as, of course, everyone has to sell and negotiate and influence day to day. So if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling other people?
Wow, that's a good question. Which age am I going back to?
Let's say 16.
Yeah. You know what I think is the most important skill that I've learned, I think, in the past, I'd say 5 years. It's the art of conversation, and listening to people, which kind of ties to like learning people's names and all these things. But I used to be very nerdy. I studied physics, math. I was very like this. I had a really long-term girlfriend, so I wouldn't go out, you know. But then a few years ago, I had to kind of break out of my shell, especially with what I do now, giving speeches in front of thousands of people, you know, and networking a ton. And that's how I do a lot of my business. I mean, in a sense, I am a salesperson. I have to sell myself. And that's come by knowing the right things to say, listening to other people, and understanding what makes people tick and make them feel good about themselves, so that when they think about me or see me, they have this positive association. And to be honest, the one book that kind of did it for me was this book by a guy named Neil Strauss called The Game. Do you know that?
I know it. I was totally massively late to The Game in the world of pickup. All my mates are into it. Yeah. And they just assumed that I knew a bit about it, because I've always been fine and happy to talk to people, so it was never a problem with me. But yeah, excellent book. I don't know how relevant some of the the pickup lines and techniques and stuff that are in it now, but the concept of it, I love it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, don't think I have a fiance and I'm happy, and I've never been that kind of guy, but I found it fascinating in terms of understanding first women at that time, but it really applies to, I think, any relationship that you develop with someone you meet, and the ways that you you know, can learn more about them and develop a positive relationship, such that, you know, in the end it may benefit you as well, you know.
Yeah, a lot. And let me just add a slight bit of context to this, just very briefly, because I don't know if this will come out before or after this episode, but I've got a pickup coach coming on the show, not to talk about picking up women, but just to talk about how to communicate with both men and women better. And I think it's again, something that, not picking up women, but communication skills should be taught in school alongside the memory side of things.
Sure.
I've got a degree in chemistry, so I'm passionate about science as well. But there's so much time that's wasted on things that aren't relevant, and I think those three, you know, especially for the bigger picture of humanity, are super important, and I think they're lacking. And with that, Nelson, I appreciate the answer. That was really candid, and I really appreciate that. I want you to tell us a little bit about the speaking that you do, where we can find out more about that, and also the amazing climbing and adventuring that you do, and where we can find out more about that as well.
I am a memory champion, so I now teach people how to do these techniques, whatever for. I mean, I've worked with athletes who need to remember plays, businessmen who need to remember sales information, or just names. Like, that's one of the most important things. Or people who want to train for a competition, memory competition. So if you go to my website, nelsondellis.com, you can personally contact me if you would like me to speak for your company, or would like to be personally trained or do a group seminar. And then also I do a lot of charitable things. I have a charity called Climb for Memory, where I climb for raising awareness and funds for Alzheimer's disease, which is the reason I started this memory journey, was because of my grandmother who had Alzheimer's and passed away in 2009. And I climb. I just came back from Mount Everest. I didn't summit. I got very close. It was my third attempt, but the point was to raise awareness for the disease and through my charity. And I try to organize little climbs here and there. So if you go to my website, Climb for Memory, you can see if I'm running a trip like Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp, things like that, and you can help me raise awareness for the disease.
Amazing stuff. And then finally, Nelson, before we wrap up, tell us a little bit about the memory competition that we've got coming up in the next few days. Yeah,
so at the end of the month, June 24th through the 26th, is a competition I started called the Extreme Memory Tournament. You can see here, that's the XMT. We hold it in San Diego, and there's been competitions for a while, but this is kind of my spin on it. It's kind of modeled after the World Cup, so you know, people play against each other in these memory matches, quick memory matches, and they're all digital, so you can watch online. We'll be broadcasting it live if you're ever curious to see what a memory competition is like. And there's a lot of prize money. The website's XMT Live, is where it'll be streaming live that weekend, end of June. So
fantastic. We'll link to all that in the show notes over at salesman.red, and we'll obviously share it promptly and when the events are on over social media as well, so that Sales Nation can check all that out. And with that, Nelson, genuinely really enjoyed our conversation, mate. Yeah. And I want to thank you for joining me on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait to see the final result.
And there we have it. Thank you, Nelson, for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Thank you, Sales Nation, for tuning in. As always, I say that every episode. And if you haven't already, you should definitely check out Michelle's episode, which was aired yesterday on the podcast, where we're talking about happiness and how that affects both you and your customers and how optimistic salespeople close more deals. There's data that shows this, so it's well worth a download. So with all that said, without further ado, I'll speak with you again tomorrow.